Welcome to Suburban On Air, Cohen in the City. And this is a very special broadcast for me with a group of old friends. Just a short while ago, Jack Silverstone, who was my boss for many years at the Canadian Jewish Congress, and I penned a editorial in the Suburban newspaper talking about Canadian Jewish Congress and how we had just celebrated our 100th anniversary if we were still in existence. Of course, the organization did not exist past 2011, but it's brought a lot of nostalgia back, and it's great for us to talk about that great organization. So Jack Silverstone, who was with CJC from 1985 to 2003, is with me. He was the executive director, executive vice president, general counsel. Les Scheininger was the president from 1989 to 1992. Dorothy Zalkman Howard was chair for the Quebec region. She was the National Executive Committee chair. So as well joining me is Renee Switzer, who was the chair of the Pacific region in Vancouver and also was a national chair of our executive. So a little reminiscing, starting off with Jack. Jack, Congress was a very special organization. I saw that the moment you hired me. I saw the respect we got. We walked into rooms to meet with ministers, editorial boards. What stands out to you?
Well, I think that the uniqueness of Congress lay in two factors. Number one was its really representative nature, which took in communities from Atlantic to Pacific all across the country, which was a very remarkable thing and gave everyone who wanted to be involved the chance to be involved. And that gave us a certain legitimacy that was, I think, recognized far and wide. And secondly, we were a human rights organization. We were a Jewish advocacy organization, but we also stood up for the human rights of others. And I think the contribution that we made, particularly through our legal interventions in various court cases and in various commissions of inquiry, really contributed in a very important way to the legal fabric and to the social fabric of the country, not just our community.
That's very well summarized. Les, we did so many amazing things. The one that stands out to me is when we had a National Executive Committee meeting in Israel, and it was a real national executive. We had people from coast to coast who came, and we made world headlines when the defense minister made some sort of comment that was negative towards Canada, and we had media swarming all over the hotel. We had Netanyahu, we had every minister. That's the kind of organization we were, Les, that we could go to Israel and have that kind of stature.
Well, we were, and picking up on Jack Silverstone's points, that resulted primarily because of the manner in which Canadian Jewish Congress was structured and the participation that we had within the organization. As far as the Israel trip is concerned, we felt that it was important at that particular time to go to Israel. And if you remember that national executive meeting, we had probably over 200 Canadians that came to Israel. It was on the eve of the Gulf War. We were there in December. Israel was bombed in January. We were the only organization, national, regional, whatever, from anywhere in the world that did not cancel their trip to Israel in December prior to the Gulf War. And you're right, there's always tension between different countries, and depending on who's in power, you will have discourse and disagreements. At that time, the Canadian government was not where we wanted them to be in terms of relationships to Israel. And if you recall, it was Moshe Aarons who got up in the initial session and he opened by saying, let me first describe the relationship between Canada and Israel today. I will say that the relationship can only go in one direction, and that is up. That made the headlines in Canada, reaction from government. It got Brian Mulroney's attention immediately too, and he clarified the position as far as he was concerned vis-a-vis Israel. So we had the presence to be able to create a forum for discussion and discourse, and I think that was important because of it was Canadian Jewish Congress, and it was the Parliament of Canadian Jewry, and it wasn't just a name. That's the way it was structured.
Very well said. Dorothy, in Quebec, of course, I worked for Congress for 10 years, 1988 to 1990, beginning of 1999. And I remember the Quebec referendum well. I remember traveling around the country with leaders from the Italian and Greek community. We formed a coalition, and the night that we almost lost our country, Parizeau blamed the money and the ethnic vote. So, Dorothy, we as Canadian Jewish Congress Quebec played a big role in keeping Canada together.
We played a tremendous role, and it was also a unique role for Congress because Congress generally was nonpartisan, and that enabled us to work with all political parties and all levels of government, and to have a lot of credibility and respect with all of those different entities. And in advocating, in forming this coalition, and we initiated the coalition, we stepped outside a little bit of our nonpartisan position because, of course, in Quebec, the perception was somewhat different from the rest of Canada. But in so doing, we had a tremendous impact, mobilizing three communities that worked together. It's an example of, it's one of many examples of how far ahead of its time Congress was. There were so many things that we did that people are talking about today and inventing today, concepts, trans movements, people talking about intersectionality for good and for bad, and talking about the emphasis today on diversity and inclusion. We were very diverse within the Jewish community. We were very inclusive, and we also were a tremendous resource for other communities. If I may, one important issue during my mandate was the Yom HaShoah legislation that was passed first in Ontario and Quebec. It was a project initiated by Congress. Moishe Ronan, the late Keith Landy, Zena Simpson, and I advocated on behalf of recognizing the Holocaust Memorial Day in the provinces. And we were in Quebec and Ontario, the third jurisdiction in the world. It's astonishing to think that we were actually able to do that. And we did that in Quebec with, at the time, there was a Parti Québécois government. So, again, here's the connection, a government that many would not consider to be sympathetic to minority communities, but in fact was very open, and it was an all-party resolution, and it opened the door to other communities. After that, we worked with the Armenian community, we worked with the Ukrainian community, and eventually legislation was passed across in provinces across Canada, and then national legislation. And the importance of this was that it created more awareness of genocide and the impact of genocide, and that has an impact on how we look at genocide today. So that's another example of
very well put. Now, Renee, one of the things I know, Jack and I, we loved our trips to Vancouver. We loved going to Vancouver. I still go there for family reasons, and I love the city. But we really were coast to coast. We're not just Toronto, Montreal, but we had a very great image in Vancouver and the Pacific region.
Yeah. I mean, CJC Pacific was, in my experience at least, it was the greatest combination of people from every socioeconomic level in our community getting together at a real grassroots level. And it was exciting. It was inspiring. There was no other place to do anything like that. So for me, the whole grassroots democratic process that went on in our community with CJC was really important. And, you know, so I miss that. I think a lot of people miss it. And in addition to that, the Soviet Jewry movement was really what got me involved in Congress in the first place. And, you know, it was just the greatest organization where people could really come together at an intellectual level and talk about issues and what they believed in, what was important to them, and how the community could contribute to the greater good of the whole Canadian society. We don't have that.
I think you're right on those, Les. We only have a couple of minutes left. Les, one of the things is Goldie Hirshon passed away on the weekend, a former president and a good friend of mine. And Goldie was one of the examples of someone who decided to seek election. We had Thomas Heck was running for president, and at the last minute, Goldie Hirshon put her hat in the ring, and she won by a narrow margin. It got coast-to-coast coverage. People came to our plenaries. They voted on resolutions. We really were the democratically elected representative of the Jewish community.
Absolutely. You know, Goldie's passing has affected all of us. She was a tremendous leader. She was compassionate. She understood the issues. She was articulate, and we depended on her. And her passing is a tremendous loss to all of us. But to go back to Dorothy's point and your point, the strength of a national organization has to be the ability to say with confidence that you're speaking on behalf of the community. And the way that you accomplish that, and you know, I'm looking forward. History is very important, but looking forward for a national organization, whether it's on behalf of a community or on behalf of a labor movement or on behalf of a political entity, they have to have the confidence to be able to say that they have consulted with their constituency. They have elected democratically their leaders. They have argued and developed their policies, and say that with confidence. I mean, one of the amazing things, and there were a number of amazing things, and what we need today is the ability to attract the diversity of opinions that exist within our community. And I'm looking back at this point. We used to have meetings on a regular basis. The national executive would meet every quarter, basically. National officers from across the country would meet at least every 6 to 8 weeks, maybe more often when needed. And at those meetings, the issues were debated, they were discussed, and we were able, as rational individuals, to reach a consensus. And that involved every segment of our community, whether you're talking, and it was unique. You could go to a meeting and have Orthodox, conservative, and Reform rabbis who would not go into each other's buildings, but would come to Canadian Jewish Congress meetings and discuss issues in an open fashion and in a friendly fashion and in a civil fashion. You had socialists, you had factory owners, you had major manufacturers, you had academics. Every kind of individual representative of the community came to our meetings, and it wasn't just on a national basis, it was on a regional basis. And you look at the kinds of people that came, they were totally representative of the community, and we were able to go to government with confidence, and they knew it. They knew it, that we spoke on behalf of the community when we presented our positions, and that's why they consulted with us. You know, it's interesting, I'm taking up time, but, I was looking at a couple of weeks ago, the commemorative book from the 1989 plenary assembly, at which I was acclaimed after doing my political work as president. And there was a letter from the prime minister at that time, Brian Mulroney, in the usual friendly fashion, But what struck me was he said in his letter, I'm looking forward to receiving the results of your resolutions. And remember, those were debated openly in front of media and media was at attendance at all of our meetings, basically. I'm looking forward to hearing the results of your resolutions, but I'm also interested in hearing what you have to say about the deficit, international relations, and the environment, even at those days. So we were able to participate as Canadians and as Jews in the process, and the contributions were immeasurable.
You're right on the mark, Les. We're going to have a part 2 in 2021 of this. There's a lot of talk about a potential CJC revival in some way. I want to thank you all for your time, and we will reconnect. All the best.
Happy
Thank you
Hanukkah.
Happy Hanukkah.
to you and Jack for getting this going.
You got it.
Appreciate it.
You got it.